And we continue with Chapter 6. Attack Pattern 2. The speaker is an engineer. Even if that prototype does collapse, I'll never say you stressed it all wrong. In this example, you stress the prototype all wrong. Is the bait, and the prototype will collapse, is a presupposed attack. You are expected to leap right in with a, "What do you mean? I stressed it all wrong. I did not," so that the attacker can spend 20 minutes of your time arguing about that in tedious detail. Don't provide that opportunity. It's a waste of your time, and it gives the attacker far more than he or she is entitled to get. This pattern also has a presupposition signaled by the heavily stressed I'll that goes like this. I'm very unique and special and wonderful and superior to all other people who might find themselves in this situation. Just respond to that sequence, saying, "I wish everyone had your good judgment," and leave the attacker with jaw hanging and a frustrated power itch. There is one exception to this strategy. There's one exception to this strategy. If and only if the attacker is in a state of genuine fear or severe distress, use the "When did you start thinking that X?" response instead. Suppose that you are a surgeon and a patient in obvious distress says to you, "Even if I do die on the operating table, my family would never sue you." In that case, you do not compliment the patient on his good judgment. You say, "When did you start thinking that you're going to die on the operating table?" Attack Pattern 3. The speaker is a stockbroker. Even a woman could manage that portfolio. This pattern, which has been mentioned briefly before, is a mystery to non-native speakers of English. It revolves around the word even, but nothing you can find in a dictionary will explain the phenomenon. It gets still more mysterious. Notice the sentence, "A woman could manage that portfolio." It means the same thing, but even is still in there, in the same way that the word "you" is still in "sell your stocks." It's not there in the surface structure of the sentence, but it's there in the presuppositions. Fortunately, native speakers of English understand the meaning of Pattern 3, even. There's that word again, if they are helpless to explain it. The presupposed attacks and the bait are not as tidily separated as in the earlier patterns, but your internal grammar will provide you with the correct analysis. Both the women and the portfolio are under attack, and we don't have enough information to determine which of the attacks is the bait. The victim would know, however, on the basis of the situation, and would take the bait by responding with one or both of these utterances. There's nothing wrong with this portfolio. It's an excellent portfolio. Women make very good financial managers, and there's nothing wrong with being a woman. Responses like these are what the verbal attacker wants, and will allow him or her to tie the victim up for a quarter hour of undignified verbal struggle. Pattern 3 presupposes that whatever fills in the blank in even and blank blank ... is inferior and second rate. Don't take the bait. Respond directly to that presupposition instead, like this. The idea that women are somehow inferior and second rate is a very common one, but I am astonished to hear it from you. Or you can say, the idea that women are somehow inferior and second rate is a very common one. I'm sorry to hear that you feel that way. It's not unusual for this pattern to be used by people who have convinced themselves that they have the best of intentions, like the teacher who tells the third graders that even the second graders can pass this test. To the child who speaks English, this is not helpful. This automobile salesperson who says, even an elderly person can drive this car, will claim that the intention was only to reassure the senior citizen. That's possible, but there's no way to be sure that the person who hears this pattern won't take it as the verbal abuse it almost always is. Attack pattern intonation. This is a suitable place to clarify something extremely important. It would be easy to get the impression that verbal attack patterns are identified by the words they contain. This isn't true. Compare the two sentences that follow. One of them is an example of attack pattern 4. The other contains exactly the same words, but it's not an attack at all. Attack pattern 4. The speaker is an architect's relative. Why do you keep building the same boring building over and over and over again? Versus, why do you keep building the same boring building over and over and over again? Do you hear the difference? If you're not sure, read the two examples aloud, giving strong emphasis to the words and parts of words written in capital letters. Listen carefully and try the simpler pair. Why did you say that? Versus, why did you say that? In all such pairs, the verbal attack is the sentence in which multiple, strong stresses give the words an abnormal intonation, an abnormal melody. The other sentence in the pair may be rude. It may be none of the questioner's business. But it is not an attack. It's a neutral request for information from someone who is interested in knowing the answer. The most typical situation is one in which the non-attack version of the utterance comes from someone talking in leveler mode, in which case you are free to level right back. Just say, it's none of your business. But be aware that no attack was intended. Verbal stress, a strong emphasis on some portion of an utterance, is part of body language. Listeners perceive it as a slight higher pitch and louder volume than the unstressed parts of the utterance have, and as slightly slower. It requires more muscular effort and more tension in the vocal tract than the unstressed elements require. For English, in which 90% of the emotional information and more than half of all information is carried by body language, this is very important. The most reliable cues you have to verbal abuse is your recognition of abnormal stress patterns in an utterance. No matter what words you hear, abnormal stress signals you to be wary. Any question that begins with the word why presupposes something like this. You have a reason for X, and I request that you tell me what that reason is. When the word why carries heavy stresses, however, there is an additional presupposition, and I know in advance that your reason is not acceptable. The heavy stress makes the question an attack and a direct challenge, and there is an effective way to handle it, called the boring Baroque response, like this. Relative, why do you keep building the same old boring buildings over and over and over again? Architect, well, I think it must be because I had such a good time doing that little office building over on 4th Street. I did that one in April of 1963, remember? That was the year that... No, wait a minute. It wasn't 1963. It was 1964. I'm sure of that because it was in 1964 that Jimmy won the tennis tournament. Or, no, maybe it was 1963 because... And so, interminably on. Your strategy here is straightforward. You do not intend to take the bait and fight about whether your buildings are boring or not. You do intend to respond to the presupposition that you have a reason and that your attacker is entitled to know what it is. You intend to demonstrate in spades that playing this game with you is going to be excruciatingly boring and unpleasant, and that the attacker would be well advised to go play it with someone else. By answering in this way, you have taken control of the exchange away from your attacker completely. This technique of answering someone into exhaustion is the single best possible way to deal with the chronic verbal abuser. Suppose you have one person in your group who is constantly attacking people with these vicious why questions. Why do you always? And why don't you ever? And the like. Your best move is to introduce the boring, Baroque response as widely as possible. When such questions are answered in full and at interminable length, with a straight face and a neutral demeanor, the verbal abuser learns that asking them is never going to be any fun, and either gives up the nasty habit or takes it elsewhere. The boring, Baroque response is also the best possible way to deal with another group of attack patterns, the ones illustrated by these examples. Attack pattern 5. Don't you even care about world hunger? Attack pattern 6. How could you possibly say something so awful? Attack pattern 7. You could at least have the decency to explain. Faced with any of these patterns, or anything like them, behave as if they were serious questions or claims and answer them as interminably as you can. Of course I care. Why, I remember a time when the statistics indicated that... I think the reason I say such awful things is because once when I was about 14 years old... I'd be happy to explain. Once in 1939, or maybe it was 1940, or maybe it was 1939, but that was the year that... Go on and on and on until it's obvious to you that your attacker regrets choosing you as the victim. As always, if the person who attacked you is someone in great pain or fear, and their state of acute crisis has triggered the attack, switch to a "when did you start thinking that X" response. There are always special circumstances in which you will want to deal with the why question by making its presupposition false on the spot. Suppose you are a doctor whose patient says, "Why don't you ever listen to me when I try to tell you my symptoms?" Or suppose you are a teacher and your student says, "Why don't you ever give me a chance to explain why my paper's late?" Unless you have rock solid evidence that the attacker could not possibly be in the right, stop and make the presupposition that you never listen or never give the person a chance to explain false. For example, "All right, tell me which symptoms is bothering you most right now." "All right, explain to me why this paper is late." And then sit down and listen with your full attention. When you have heard the speaker out, either discuss the issue raised at that point or promise to do so at the first possible opportunity. And keep your promise. Say, "I wish I could stay and discuss this with you right now, but I can't. But I'll be back this afternoon and we'll talk about it then." Or, "But if you'll come to my office hours Tuesday morning, we can talk about it then." Whatever fits your situation. Occasionally, you will run into a verbal abuser who is a native speaker of English, but insists that he or she can't be held responsible for verbal attacks because I can't hear those stress patterns. I don't even know they're there. You can determine very quickly whether the claim of tone deafness is true or not. Just say this: even you should be able to hear this pattern. If, as has always happened in my experience, the verbal abuser reacts angrily to that sentence, the claim is false. I'm going to stop here and continue with attack pattern 8. I think it's too many pages to get through at this time. Yeah, there's more. I don't know. I'll give it a try. I don't have too much battery left. So, attack pattern 8. The speaker is a hospital administrator. Everyone understands why you can't get along with any of your colleagues, Miss Jones. This attack relies on human frailty and signals a fishing expedition. Because you are a human being, you are almost certain to have at least one unpleasant personal secret. It may be something of major significance, or it may be trivial. Whatever it is, however silly or serious, others might find it. It looms large to you, and you don't want it to be public knowledge. The verbal abuser who uses the everyone understands pattern is counting on that, and is counting on you to react by thinking, "Oh no, they found out," and blurting out an apology or explanation. Like this: Administrator, everyone understands why you can't get along with your colleagues, Miss Jones. Miss Jones, look, I know I shouldn't keep taking time off because of this knee. I know it makes it hard on everybody, but if you people could just give me a little more time. This is a mistake. The chances are good that until Jones began talking, the administrator was unaware of the knee problem. Now she knows that are anything but favorable. Wait a minute. And Jones has handed her the information on a platter, under conditions that are anything but favorable. This should not happen. Instead, the dialogue should go like this: Administrator, everyone understands why you can't get along with your colleagues, Miss Jones. Miss Jones, well, I want you to know that I appreciate their support. Now the administrator is in an awkward position. Now it appears that if there really is a problem, everyone knows it except her. She could say, "I meant everyone understands except me," or "I don't understand anything, actually. I was just fishing." But if she had that kind of courage, she wouldn't have tried this shabby tactic in the first place. Throughout the exchange, it's crucially important for your body language, and especially the intonation of your voice, to remain calm, neutral, and controlled. If any of your responses sound sarcastic or insolent, as they will if you include too many strong stresses on words or parts of words, they will be perceived as counterattacks, and they will fail. The bait in this example is, you can't get along with your colleagues. The attacker expects you either to take that bait and begin protesting that you do not have problems getting along with your colleagues, or to blurt out your secret, as in the first dialogue above. Don't do either of those things. Notice that 3 elements in the attack pattern 8 example are emphasized by strong stress. This intonation will tell you that you're under verbal attack, no matter how many kind and caring words may be thrown in to distract you. The fact that an attack has darling tacked on at one end and honey tacked on at the other will not confuse you if you are listening for the stress patterns. It's normal for English sentences to have one word containing a strong stress, usually just before or at the end of the sentence. If this stress is marked at all in print, it will be underlined. It's normal for them to contain what is called contrastive stress, as in it wasn't $20, it was $30, and Ellen didn't call that in, she mailed it. It's normal for 2 or more strong stresses to jump up in questions when someone isn't sure they heard correctly, as in, she said the president called. And it's normal to hear strong stresses in emergency situations, as in, look out, it's on fire. Or in news bulletins such as, hey, I won the sweepstakes. Your internal grammar contains a checklist of the environments in which several strong stresses in a single sentence are normal, and it includes all of these. Otherwise, this rule holds. When you hear 2 or more strong stresses in any one sentence in the speech of an adult, come to full alert. This is not being neurotic or paranoid. It's evidence that you are linguistically competent. Attack pattern 9. A speaker is a dentist. You're not the only patient I have, you know. This pattern is so easy to deal with that it's hard to understand why it is so widely used. The only possible explanation is that it works. That is, people fall for it. They respond with, "What do you mean by that?" which gives the attacker permission to provide a list of their faults and flaws. Or they go into placater mode and respond like this. Patient: "Oh, Dr. Everett, I know that. Oh, dear, I have been behaving like I thought I was your only patient. I assure you I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry. I know how busy you are, and I know that you have hundreds of people counting on you and wanting your time, and this is absurd. All that the attack logically presupposes is I have other patients. The bait is composed entirely of the intonation and the context. There is only one appropriate response to any attack of this kind, and that response is cheerful agreement. I couldn't agree with you more. You're absolutely right. Something of that kind. The chances of the presupposed item being false are near zero. Just agree with it and leave the attacker trying to figure out what to do next. The same thing is true for attack pattern 10, which is a not very subtle attempt in computer mode that goes like this. Some managers would fire an employee who couldn't meet the sales quotas. As with pattern 9, the chances that this is not true for some managers somewhere are almost non-existent, and the proper response is, "I'm sure that's true." A basic strategy to remember: anytime a verbal attack presupposes some innocuous statement that is 99% certain to be true in the real world, your best move is probably to ignore everything else and agree with that statement. Always, this accomplishes 4 useful things. It surprises the attacker. It short-circuits the verbal violence loop planned for you. It transmits the message that you refuse to play the attacker's game. It obliges the attacker to make a new move if he or she wants to continue on the offense. We have now looked at 10 English verbal attack patterns. There are others, but the set is small. My guess is that there could not be more than 50, and that 25 is a more likely total. When you run into what you think might be a new pattern, the first thing to do is to try rewording it. Put it into different styles and different satire modes. How many ways could you say roughly the same thing? Most of the time, this rewording exercise will demonstrate that it's not a new attack, but a variation on a pattern you already know. You will be able to recognize verbal attacks, no matter what their wording, in 3 ways: by the abnormal emphatic stresses they contain, by their distinctive intonation, by the rest of the nonverbal communication that accompanies them, by the context, the situation in which they occur, and the information you have about the people involved in the situation. Faced with any verbal attack, familiar or unfamiliar, your first step is to divide it into presupposed attacks and bait. Sometimes the division will be very clear, as in pattern 1. Sometimes the 2 elements will be scrambled and interwoven. But your internal grammar will always be able to identify the parts. And once you know what they are, you follow 3 simple rules. Rule 1, ignore the bait, no matter how outrageous. Rule 2, respond directly to one of the presuppositions. Rule 3, no matter what you do, transmit the meta message. Don't try that with me, it won't work. I won't play that game. Verbal attack patterns function in communication as action chains. An action chain is a behavioral sequence with distinct parts in a distinct order, which, if interrupted, usually has to be started all over again if it is to be completed. A handshake is an example of a nonverbal action chain. For the verbal attacker, this action chain has 3 steps. The attacker begins the action chain by using one of the verbal attack patterns. The intended victim takes the bait and responds to it directly. There is a volley of verbal abuse from both parties until one is exhausted. Interrupting this sequence, like interrupting a handshake, makes it almost impossible for the attacker to complete it satisfactorily without starting all over again with a new attack. Anything you say that has this effect and is not just more verbal abuse will be an improvement over going right into step 2 of the chain, which is the intended victim takes the bait and responds to it directly. I'm going to stop here. We start next with problems with the technique. The third part of chapter 6. I think I'll finish it when we get to that one. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the traffic and the dam on chapter 6, malpractice of the mouth and verbal violence. I sure appreciate you.